Today we're going to be talking about why America was depressed in the 1970s. And I would have started off in our conversation asking if you ever had a friend who was depressed and they just kind of sit around and they're not really excited about life and they are kind of lethargic and they don't really get interested in many things. And so we see the whole country kind of acting in that way in the 1970s. And there was a variety of reasons for that. So let's start off by seeing what was happening during the Ford administration. Okay, so Ford became president once Nixon resigned. And he was the only person who had ever served in this position without having been elected on a national ticket. Because what had happened was Nixon had when he was running for re-election in 1972, Spiro Agnew was his vice president. And he was involved with some criminal activity on his own before he was selected as vice president. And while he was serving as vice president, this illegal activity came to light and he was forced to resign. And so there was an opening in the for vice president. So Nixon picked Ford. He was a member of the House of Representatives. So he was elected by his district. Ford was elected by his district in Texas, but he was never elected on a national ticket. So he's the only president who has ever been in that situation. So once he became president, he pardoned Nixon. And, the president has an absolute power to pardon people. According to the Constitution. So that's what happened. So other people had gone to jail who were involved with all of the shenanigans, if I can use that word, associated with the Nixon administration, like bribery and break-in and their dirty tricks and all that stuff. So people had gone to jail for that, but Nixon was pardoned. And then people started to talk about if there was a deal made between Ford and Nixon. And next we see Ford offering clemency to draft evaders and deserters during the Vietnam War. Okay, so that's something else that happened. Jimmy Carter became president later and pardoned the remaining people. So here I wrote that he gave them clemency, but not amnesty. So what that means is that this is an official statement. Clemency means that the government's not going to prosecute you for your behavior. Amnesty means like a legal forgiveness as if it didn't happen, like a pardon. Okay. And then during the 1970s, there was a terrible economic situation called stagflation. And this was an economic anomaly, which means that the economists didn't know how to deal with this. Because what they saw during the 1970s was inflation and high unemployment at the same time. So remember that inflation means rising prices, and normally if people are losing their jobs, according to the laws of supply and demand, there's lower demand, so the prices are going to come down. And that was not happening here in the 1970s, so economists didn't know what to do. Okay. And this is happening because of the oil embargo discussed on the next page. So I'll talk about that more later. But in the 1970s, the United States, which had been an oil exporter, began to import oil. So that kind of changed our situation. And a cartel called OPEC was created. And OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting countries. So we have these countries that produce petroleum and they export them and they are going to control the prices together. So this is known as a cartel. It's sort of like a monopoly, but it's with a bunch of different countries here, but they are controlling the prices. Okay, so let's talk about how these events might have contributed to a feeling of depression. Well, the system kind of seemed unfair when you see the president getting pardoned, draft dodgers getting clemency and then pardoned. It seemed like some people are getting away with illegal activity and other people are going to jail or going off to fight. Economists didn't know how to deal with stagflation. The United States became an oil importer, signifying that it could no longer meet its own energy needs. Typo there. Okay, let's move on to the Carter administration. We start off with voter apathy. Only 53% of eligible voters bothered to cast their ballots. Well, why? Because they didn't really care. They saw the government as corrupt. Remember, this is an era after Watergate, after Vietnam. Why should we bother to vote for these people? Who cares? It doesn't really matter. And that's called voter apathy. It's a huge problem in our country. We see this oil embargo, very, very important in the 1970s. OPEC said, we don't want to sell oil to the United States. They were annoyed with the United States for its support for Israel, for its in general meddling in the affairs of other nations. And this caused a huge problem because petroleum, which is what gasoline is made out of, it's used for home heating oil, plastics, fertilizers, paint, ink, and other items. So this was a problem. And now the United States was suffering from a trade deficit where a nation is buying more foreign goods than it exports. Okay, so let's talk about how these feelings would have increased our depression as a country. Well, we have voter apathy. We're not going to get off the couch to go vote. We have this increased oil dependency, rising prices, OPEC raising the prices of oil, crippling the United States economy. That revealed an Achilles heel for the United States. And we seem to be so powerful, but really we can be broken over oil. And the United States became a debtor nation, which is a far cry from where we were at the end of World War I. Do you remember the United States emerged from World War I as a creditor nation and the world's largest exporter? And now here we are in the 1970s. We're now a debtor nation. Okay, so let's talk about some other problems. These are some environmental problems and some other economic problems. Some stagflation was hitting some of these really big companies. And so the government authorized huge loans to corporations to keep them in business. Now, the goal was to prevent massive layoffs where people would lose their jobs. But, to the ordinary person, it might appear that the government was helping out their big business friends and not necessarily helping out the average person when they can't pay their heating bill. And then we have the situation of how are we going to deal with our energy issues. There's toxic air pollution called acid rain. That was a huge problem. Nixon tried to deal with this by creating the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Remember, we talked about Silent Spring, the book written by Rachel Carson. Okay, so then there were some other environmental issues. Carter put solar panels on the White House, and that was kind of a forward-thinking nod to saying, all right, we can solve our problems by looking to alternative sources of energy. And in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan took the solar panels down off of the White House. Okay, and his attitude was that we don't need to change our lifestyle. We can just adapt. And then we see that coal is polluting the air, and we had no way to deal with this situation. And we have, turning to nuclear power, we have a situation where there was a nuclear power plant leak in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is called the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant. And government officials and people running the power plant assured people that there were no problems as a result of this accident, but other studies found that lung cancer rates and leukemia rates were much higher downwind of 3 Mile Island than in other places. So these contributed to the feelings of depression because we see bailouts to large corporations. There's no answer to our energy problem. We've got coal polluting, higher standards for cars were expensive, nuclear energy was dangerous, and solar panels were an option, but they were just not pursued. It was very expensive, we'll say. Okay. This was not good for the American psyche. People didn't have access to enough gas. They started rationing gas based upon license plate numbers. You could only get gas on certain days. But it really made Americans feel angry at the world that, we're supposed to be a superpower. How could OPEC have this much power over us? How could OPEC force us to buy a small car like this? And people were just generally dissatisfied. Talking about our foreign affairs issue, the Panama Canal Treaty. Well, Carter tried to negotiate all foreign policy dealings on the basis of human rights, and he was trying to act respectfully towards our neighbors, and so he negotiated to give the Panama Canal back to Panama in 1999 as promised. Okay, so he didn't really do anything new because remember that we had a 99-year lease on that land to build the Panama Canal when Teddy Roosevelt helped Panama become an independent nation from Colombia. And Carter was criticized by his running opponent, Ronald Reagan, in the 1980 election for signing this treaty, saying that, it shows a decline in American power. Why should we give up control over the canal? But Carter felt it was important to do that. Moving on to Iran. If you recall from last year, and we'll talk about this more, the United States kind of put in place a ruler in Iran that was friendly to the United States interests, but he was not very nice to the people in his country, and he would suppress people's rights, and he would have people beaten by the police, and he would lock people up for their political views. So eventually the people rebelled, and they ran him out of town, and they installed Ayatollah Khomeini, and they put in a fundamental religious Islamic government that's still in place today. At the time, they stormed the American embassy and took 52 staff members hostage, and they were held hostage for 444 days. It was a very big deal as it was happening. Every day they would count. It's day 10 in the hostage crisis. It's day 11 in the hostage crisis. It's day 40. It's day 100. The whole world was watching. And Carter tried to free the hostages. And at one point he sent in a helicopter of Marines to try to get them, but they landed too close to sand, and the sand kicked up and got into the helicopter, and the helicopter was destroyed, and the Marines got killed. It was a total disaster. Eventually, Carter was able to negotiate their release, and 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, the hostages were released. Then, with respect to the Soviet Union, they had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Now, we had been experiencing some détente or an easing of tensions with the Soviet Union during this time, but the invasion of Afghanistan ended that. And Carter, fresh from the Vietnam loss, said we're not going to have another Vietnam, so we're not sending troops to Asia to fight again. So he stopped grain sales, and he refused to allow American participation in the 1980 Olympics held in Moscow. And again, he was criticized. This is a wimpy response. You need to take a stand. Where is American might, American power? It's not fair to the Olympians, the athletes who trained their whole lives for this. So he took a lot of heat for that. Okay. Overall, a feeling of depression. It seems like the reduction of American power in the world. The Iranians ousted a U.S.-backed leader and took Americans captive, and it took over a year to get them released. One could even say that it impacted the 1980 election because it was unlikely that Carter could be reelected if these hostages were not released. So, if we're talking about foreign interference in an American election and us not being able to stand up to that, this is like a more subtle version of that. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the U.S. refused to stand up to them, simply boycotting the Olympics instead. And so then Jimmy Carter gave this crisis of confidence speech. He's saying that this attitude of Americans is threatening to destroy social and political fabric. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. Material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or no purpose. And then I highlighted these two paragraphs talking about why people might have been feeling this way. Ours was a nation of the ballot, not the bullet. But then we saw the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. We were taught that our armies were always invincible. But then we have the situation in Vietnam. We respected the presidency until the shock of Watergate. We remember when the phrase sound as a dollar was an expression of absolute dependability. And then 10 years ago, 10 years of inflation began to shrink our dollar and our savings. We believed our nation's resources were limitless until 1973 when we had to face a growing dependence on foreign oil. So these are some of the historical factors that would have led Americans to feel like, wow, we have really declined as a nation. And so he's motivating people to stop crying and start sweating, stop talking and start walking, stop cursing and start praying. We need to come from, the change needs to come from every house in America. So he felt that this crisis of confidence Americans were losing their faith in the idea of America as a place for democracy, justice, equality, and a guiding force for good in the world. People do not support this vision, the dream of America can slip away. And this can be compared to Lincoln's speech when he says we cannot allow this dream to perish from this earth, this nation to perish from this earth. Okay, so how does his attitude compare with JFK's attitude? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. He's asking Americans to support their country and have faith in our institutions. And Carter's speech was widely criticized while JFK's is celebrated. Will Carter point out that Americans were apathetic and materialistic? It's never a good idea to insult your audience. He hints that Americans should stop complaining and support the country. Okay, so this speech did not help him get reelected, we'll say that much. Okay, so going on back to our aim, why was America depressed in the 1970s? Well, we had economic problems. I'm just going to be vague about this so you can fill in more details. Economic problems and political problems, international problems, energy problems, and you can fill all that in on your AIM response, please. Have a great day, everybody.